Thank you so much. Thank you, Claudia.
You're welcome.
Fellow Coptics, would you like to clear the way for more synchronicity and God's grace to enter into your lives?
Yes.
Yes. Resounding, yes.
Yes.
Would you like to experience less drama and more joy and creativity?
You betcha.
Yes. All right. Great. Would you like to be able to have more control over the events in your life?
Yeah.
Yes. And if I told you that all you needed to do was let go of your ego, would you believe me? Yes.
Yes.
Not quite as certain on that one. But I did get a yes. All right. Wonderful. Our ego is often defined as an inflatable sense of pride, or sometimes as a superior nature or a superior feeling over others. Sometimes our ego is defined as the stable center and core of our personality. Other times our ego is defined as our conscious mind, that which we are aware, or the way that we are aware of ourself and our own existence. That is the definition by Freud, by the way. It is oftentimes that our ego gets a bad rap because we think of it from the humanistic point of view. That is that we are often have our ego being an inflated sense of self, or an inflated sense of superiority and pride over others. That is when we think of the ego in terms of negative, and I consider that to think of the ego from the humanistic point of view. We can also think of our ego, though, from a spiritual point of view and see it as positive, that we have a great sense of self that is positive and is loving of ourselves and of our life and our world around us. It is when we do that that we open up our life and allow synchronicity to come in. Those are the definitions of ego. Because we can look at our ego from both perspectives, the human perspective or the spiritual perspective, we can say that we can have a healthy ego, or we can have a neurotic ego. Our neurotic ego is associated with our tendencies to do reprehensible actions. Our neurotic ego is associated with that. Our neurotic ego is also associated with our feelings of low self-esteem and unworthiness. When we act upon those neurotic tendencies and express our neurotic ego in ways of not being self-assured, low self-esteem, then we are allowing our neurotic ego to affect our actions, and we act out in a negative way. Now, our healthy ego, on the other hand, is associated with creative impulses. It's also associated with realistic insights and with positive actions. We express our healthy ego when we think of ourselves in a positive light, or when we have a conscious belief that we are good, or when we see our life as positive and wonderful and joyous. As Claudia mentioned from Hamid Bey, our ego does serve a purpose. Our healthy ego serves the purpose of showing us what it is we need to see about ourselves. And I believe that the negative ego has the purpose of showing us and warning us and protecting us. Now, the healthy ego, in showing us what it is we need to see about ourselves, we also need to consider that our relationships are like mirrors, reflecting back to us what it is we need to see about ourselves. And if you think of the ego as being our relationship with ourselves, then the ego is showing us what it is we need to know and what it is we need to see about ourselves. In that regard, we always need to ask, what is it that I need to know about myself, especially when our ego comes up and we actually acknowledge and think about our ego, whether we think about our healthy ego or we think about our negative and neurotic ego. It's always about us, and it's always what we need to see about ourselves. Does that make sense? Seems so. Come with me? Okay. All right. So whenever we are expressing and feeling our healthy ego, what I would like for us all to do is to celebrate. We have some smiles out there at celebrate. And I mean really celebrate. I mean do something vigorous, do a vigorous action. I mean either do a jig around your living room or raise your hands above your head or clap your hands and say, yay, I have something to celebrate. I'm doing something good. Do you know why? Because our ego, our healthy ego, needs to express the joyous sense of self that is within us. And at some point in time, our neurotic ego will take over and tell you, oh, you don't really need to acknowledge that. Yeah, that's all right. You know, you don't need to do that. But our body, our mind, and our soul really does need that sense of joy. It desires that sense of joy, and we need to give it to it. Give it to yourself and celebrate that sense of joyfulness in yourself. Now, if you ever find yourself expressing the negative aspects of your ego or the neurotic ego, then I ask you and suggest to you that you release it and give it up by acknowledging it and then giving it up in a meditative state. To acknowledge your ego is to understand that whatever is happening to you at this moment, it bears some connection to what has happened to you in the past. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
How often do we have something happen to us now in the present moment, and we realize and recognize, wow, this has happened to me before, only someone else has done it to me. Or maybe you do recognize, wow, I've done this before, and it really wasn't a very positive or favorable event at that time. It didn't feel very pleasant. So by acknowledging that and understanding and accepting that your ego played some part in that, and realizing it, recognizing it, and then during a meditative state, you give it up. And by give up, I bring to mind also the acronym that I've used before, GIVE, God's infinite vibration, engaging universal power. So when we acknowledge that, oh, there's something from my past that's reoccurring and my ego has been involved in this. And in a meditative state, you acknowledge that and you give it up to the higher power that overlights you. Then it's amazing how you engage universal power, which is the force of manifestation. And then things begin to change. And how quickly it begins to change can sometimes be a miracle and sometimes be really outstanding. But it is all when we acknowledge it and we give it up and we let go of the situation and we open ourselves up to God's synchronicity and God's grace at that time. I've been reading a book called Shadow Dance by David Richo, and he says that change is the result of psychological work on our ego. Transformation is the release of love, perennial wisdom, and healing power from our inner self. Change is the automatic result of effort. Transformation is the possible result of grace, though it is often responsive to our spiritual practices. Psychological work is meant to lead to a healthier ego, and that is sanity. Spiritual practice is meant to release the inestimable riches of the self. This is sanctity. Put a little more simply, acknowledge your ego, release the riches of your inner self, and experience more love and joy. I say, release your neurotic ego, embrace your inner positive, healthy sense of self, and clear the way for God's grace and synchronicity to enter into your life. Let it in, let it in, let it in. Laura Joy?
Yes. I'm gonna let it in.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.